I thought today I'd show you a little painting that is so simple that even if you've never painted, you can do this one.
Here we go. All ones. Today we have Josh Harrison, a developer of Earthdawn at FASA today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Josh. I started with FASA Games about 7 years ago with the launch of Earthdawn 4th Edition, was one of the major players involved in getting that put together and out the door. And with the help of an excellent group of folks that we have put together as a team in the subsequent time, and still working on that, and part of the group that's continuing to shepherd the line forward.
Okay, how did you get into gaming and game development?
My gaming starts back in probably like 83 or 84 when I was like 8 or 9 years old. Got off the bus one day, stopped by a friend's house, and his older brother and dad and a couple of other people from the neighborhood, I think, were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and got sat down, and they were like, oh yeah. And it was some kind of like homebrew thing. They like, I remember, I think the character that I had like a laser pistol or something like that. But that was my first introduction. And it was not too long after that like started playing with my friend, a couple of friends from the area, and ended up getting the red box Menser basic Dungeons and Dragons set, and ended up sort of defaulting to being the dungeon master, and just kind of went on from there.
Oh, very cool. I remember the old red box myself. What games did you play outside of Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, I did Dungeons and Dragons for many years. Was kind of aware of some others because of my exposure to the TSR Game Order Hobby Shot catalog that I got once or twice, with all the really cool stuff that was in there. But the launching point beyond that was for Christmas, I want to say my senior year of high school. I got the hardcover 2nd edition Shadowrun book, which was not only my introduction to games outside of D&D, real introduction, but also my introduction to FASA as a company. And thought that was cool, and fooled around with that a little bit with some friends that spring, and a little bit in the summer. And so that was sort of the beginning of that. Earthdawn, which I sort of consider my biggest gaming love at this point, even now 25 plus years later, was released at Gen Con that summer, 1993. And I learned about it when I was at my freshman semester at college that fall of 93, that they're like, oh, FASA put out release this fantasy game, and there's like a lot of similarities in the art and everything between Shadowrun and Earthdawn. So I was on a first semester internet access for the first time ever, signed up for news groups and mailing lists and things like that. Picked up the Earthdawn 1st edition hardcover book at a local bookstore where I was going to college in upstate New York around Christmas, and it went on from there.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask you how you got into FASA Games. How did you get into game development?
A lot of that comes from being a perennial game master. There, some game masters, some folks who run games will just run published stuff, but there is a not insignificant portion of us who are sort of, by creating our own stories, and sometimes finding things that don't work so well in the game that we're playing, or that we wish worked a little bit a different way, are kind of like armchair designers and homebrewers and things like that. But I didn't, aside from the kind of homebrew stuff that I would do for my home games, whether Earthdawn or D&D, which I still played occasionally, or the various other RPGs that I played and so forth in the latter half of the 90s, including White Wolf stuff like Vampire the Masquerade and so forth. It wasn't until like around 2000, around the time that the original iteration of FASA kind of closed up shop and sold off some of their properties, and decided that I think rightly so, given what was going on at the time, that they we're not going to continue actively producing games anymore, that I sort of got involved with the attempts to keep Earthdawn going, both with Living Room Games. I signed on as a play tester with them, so did some play testing of the second edition of Earthdawn. Then got involved in the Red Brick Classic Edition, which was an attempt to kind of collate and fix up some aspects of the first edition run, trying out this new print-on-demand technology that was coming around in the early 2000s. And then as part of that, ended up basically kind of trying to rewrite a lot of the Magic Theory stuff in Earthdawn, because I really, really liked it and felt that the presentation could perhaps be cleaned up to make it easier for other people to understand.
Could you talk to us a little bit more about that and your motivation, your style, and what you did to keep that going?
Yeah. So I was involved pretty heavily in the online Earthdawn community in the latter half of the 90s, on the Earthdawn mailing list, which a few, several people that I kind of still am acquaintances with were on, as well as Lou Prosperi, who was line developer for Earthdawn throughout the first edition. And we would have him. Yeah, we had discussions about rules and setting and all sorts of other stuff. And sometimes a lot of the questions that would come up in those discussions revolved around Magic Theory, particularly in Earthdawn, like pattern magic and how the various aspects of patterns and threads and all that sort of stuff kind of worked together. And through those discussions and questions with Lou and things like that, I had a fairly decent handle on what was going on. Like I grokked it pretty well. And so when the opportunity kind of came along to rewrite that material, I sort of, in conversations with James, who was the head of Red Brick, like he was putting people together to work on the classic edition, putting things together, and offered, hey, I'll do this. And so kind of took the first edition manuscript, he had kind of scanned it all in, and basically went through and like red penned it and like moved sections around and tried to build a better flow in terms of introducing the different ideas and how they connected and moved from one to the other. And so it was a kind of tapping into some latent education aspects. My parents were both teachers, and while at in my teens and early 20s, you probably wouldn't have been able to get me into a class, like as a teacher. If you had paid me lots and lots of money, and teachers definitely don't get paid lots of money. But there is that aspect of education and wanting to convey information and helping people understand things better. That's really just kind of a part of my natural personality makeup. And so being able to do that in a text and to edit and write and edit for clarity and like idea A to B to C, and try to help make these kind of esoteric concepts a little bit more understandable, I loved it. And then sort of continued on with some additional work with Red Brick, doing some additional just general editing and feedback, because I also had a pretty good handle on a lot of the setting lore and the details. And for some of the new projects that they did, like as they started to get into third edition, for example, the history chapter of the Kratos source book, I didn't do a lot of writing on it, but I did a lot of sort of editing development, which was going through and saying, okay, you have these ideas, but this doesn't really fit given what we know, and sort of fact checking and making sure that the history of this place that was being kind of created out of very little that had been presented before made sense both within itself and within the wider setting of Barsave. And so that was sort of my early days into semi-professional, design and writing work.
So have you worked on any games besides Earthdawn?
Not really, no. What ended up happening is that largely around the time that Classic was shifting into third edition, I at that point had gotten married, was having kids, and my life at that point didn't really afford me the time to devote to game development, because it was a sideline, it was a hobby. I was making basically nothing at it, which was fine, because it was largely, hey, I love this game, I love this setting, and I'm working on it, and that's great. And so for about 3 or 4 years, I forget exactly at this point, I was just kind of aware of what was going on and running a home game, but not really doing any actual development or writing work. Then when my kids got a little bit older, and life had shifted around to the point where I was looking to get back to it, was right around the time that Red Brick was finishing up, and went to Gen Con. It was my first Gen Con, I want to say, and basically was approached by James, not directly, but sort of in a sideline way, where, because he was looking to, because of various things that have been going on with him, was looking to get out of development, of not really working on anything anymore.
Oh, wow.
But was kind of reluctant to do so without making sure that Earthdawn ended up in good hands. And I asked him sort of at the end of the convention, hey, when you mentioned that, were you kind of like suggesting that you'd like me to come in and do it? And he said, if you're willing.
Oh, wow.
And I basically at that moment went, yeah, I think, yeah, let me give that a try. Not knowing really at that point what I was getting myself in for. And then, sort of making some, like, okay, if I'm going to do this, here are the things that I'm going to do. And that began sort of my tenure as an Earthdawn developer officially, and the decisions very shortly thereafter to do 4th edition. And that was right around the beginning of FASA Games as a company and that sort of thing.
I'd like to ask a little bit about that. Is how did FASA come back?
So
a lot of people want to know this.
I don't know a lot of the specific details, because I wasn't really involved at that point. I kind of came in during that first year. Red Brick had the license and was a separate company. There were some things that went on with regards to Red Brick and what happened with them at the tail end. I've kind of talked about it in some places. There are some personal things that aren't really mine to talk about. They are kind of known if you know where to look. James had gone through a really, really devastating personal event, and that kind of affected everything. It was part of the reason why he was looking to get out. And so Red Brick was closing up. It was a company that was sort of founded and originated in New Zealand, and James had moved to the US, and basically sort of wanted to see things continuing to go forward, but Red Brick as a company wasn't really going to be around anymore, and sort of convinced Ross Babcock, who was one of the founders of the original FASA, and who's still, the company itself, FASA, is still existed as a corporation, largely just kind of holding on to a couple of IPs that had reverted back to them. Earthdawn was one of them. And basically said, hey, let's have a company that will continue to produce the things that we have licenses for, but let's make it an official subsidiary of the original FASA Corp. And so FASA Games is not unlike Living Room Games or Red Brick, which were separate companies that were licensing from FASA, the Earthdawn IP, among 1 or 2 other things. FASA Games is an actual wholly owned subsidiary of FASA Corp. Ross Babcock himself is on the board of the company, so he is still involved. Sort of kind of helps handle the business side of things, and helps make sure that us creatives kind of keep on track and at least reasonably on schedule, which is, so he's got a lot of experience with game production, because he's been around it for a really long time. And while he was not quite so actively involved in it in, say, the past, 15 to 20 years or so. He still knows a lot of people and understands a lot of things that I sure as heck don't, because I was largely just an enthusiastic amateur and in some ways still feel like one. So he is involved. And so because of the timing and because of what was going on, there is a perception that FASA Games is merely a rebranding of Red Brick that is trying to cash in on the old FASA name. That's not really accurate. Certainly James was involved in the establishment of FASA Games, but he did not stick around for very long after that was done, because in similar to kind of the way that he handed Earthdawn off to me, he made sure that sort of other people were involved in other stuff and then, went off to his own thing. I still chat with him occasionally and he's still kind of around, but hasn't been involved in the operations of FASA Games in 7 years or so.
Oh, well,
that's kind of where things are.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about this. I was just like, oh, FASA's back. So what drew you to Earthdawn over other games to begin with?
It was largely the setting originally, because as someone who was steeped so deeply in Dungeons and Dragons as my primary role-playing experience up until I ran into Shadowrun, Earthdawn is a setting that is very intentionally a response of sorts to Dungeons and Dragons, that it takes these iconic stereotypes and tropes of D&D style fantasy and builds a setting around them that makes sense. So, exploring dungeons. Well, okay, there are these massive underground complexes filled with monsters and treasure. Why did those exist? Well, there was a magical apocalypse that everybody built these big things to hide away in, and some of them got broken into, and so there are monsters and there's loot to be had and so forth. And it was just so the initial idea was really basic in some respects, as far as like the original Earthdawn first edition is. It's like, hey, here's your stereotypical D&D style fantasy with the same kind of world building that you see from FASA in Shadowrun, or BattleTech, games that were their IPs that all revolved as much around the story of what was going on as the system itself, which is a very like sort of 90s thing. You'll see that in a lot of game lines that came out around that time. But then as the ongoing story of Earthdawn developed with various setting books and whatnot, it became really, 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 really cool. It was the first real, I want to say mature, for lack of a better term, campaign that I ran was Earthdawn, which was to say, like, I was an adult and was playing with other adults, and we were doing like a real, ongoing story kind of campaign thing, as opposed to the hacky, fun but kind of dumb stuff that I did as a teenager back with D&D. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but as I got older and my tastes kind of matured, and the gaming community and the gaming environment was sort of maturing in one sense along with them in the 90s with White Wolf and FASA and Pinnacle / AEG with like Deadlands and Legend of the Five Rings and all of these other sort of fantastic, like really rich setting games. Seventh Sea, the original iteration of that, coming out in the 90s. So there was a lot of that real sort of story gaming stuff that was developing.
It's
but
kind
also
of going more from role playing with the dice to role playing as a playing a role. I think it really developed in the 90s.
Yeah. But also, to be fair, a lot of the games in those days were still very heavily tied to the more crunchier end of the mechanic range. Shadowrun and World of Darkness games, Vampire, Mage, Werewolf, all of those. Seventh Sea, GURPS, like all sorts of, like, these are all still fairly crunchy games, and Earthdawn is, you know, right there in the thick of it as well. You haven't quite gotten to the point yet in the 90s there of games that we have today, like the various Powered by the Apocalypse games, or Fate and its associated games,
Mhm.
you know, or any of these others that are a lot sort of mechanically lighter, but still leaning into that sort of narrative storytelling aspect of things.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, it was, you know, the kids, you know, the people, folks of my generation who kind of grew up through their preteen and teen years with D&D, and the shift that was also happening there in the 90s as TSR was slowly but very obviously collapsing.
Mhm.
And you know, the rise of various other games that were coming on in there. You also had Palladium with Rifts and
Oh yeah.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I mean, just a lot of stuff. That kind of real 90s zeitgeist that was kind of going on with gaming at that point. And I came of age and sort of developed my own storytelling sensibilities in my early 20s there through the 90s, and kind of carried that forward, but continued to pay attention to what was going on.
Okay,
Um,
with that kind of concept, where is FASA's plans to develop Earthdawn in the future and kind of progressing this and culturally and just expand the world in general?
well,
I may not have
so
explained that too well.
no, I understand what you're getting at. Earth Dawn fourth edition, one of the goals that I set for myself, and that has sort of subsequently been adopted largely by the rest of the development team as they came on, is that fourth edition was going to try and do a couple of things. One was to try and explore areas and parts of Bar Save that hadn't really been explored before, because one of the criticisms of Red Brick and third edition was that there wasn't a whole lot of original material that was put out for it. You had the Kratos source book, you had some original adventures that were put out for it. The Cathay books were put out as well, but for the most part, a lot of third edition was reprinting reprinting previous books, updated a little bit for the timeline, and with new, the third edition mechanics. And one of the things that I didn't want to do with fourth edition was basically make the first several books that came out, oh, these are all reprints of stuff you've already got, just with the new mechanics, because that would play into the perception of, like, oh, this is a new edition simply as a cash grab,
Yeah.
because the previous edition was kind of going out under this pall of everything that happened at the tail end of the Red Brick era. And so I wanted to do some new things. There were a couple of books that were sort of in development at the tail end of third edition, that I thought could perhaps be worked up for fourth as early source books, but they were still going to be like new material. There was a book on Travar, for example, which was one of our first supplements. There was an Elven Nations book that we ended up not using the original manuscript for because it was fine as a book as it was, but it did some things with its exploration of areas outside of Bar Save that didn't really gel with what we were looking to do as far as the setting, at least at that point in time, and had brought in, and this is actually where Kyle and Carl and Michael sort of came in, as they came in and they basically knocked out a brand new manuscript for Shosara and Seriatha
wow.
in the space of a few months, because we
Oh,
had
wow.
a book that we had promised, and I couldn't really work on it because I had read the previous manuscript and wanted to avoid possibly having ideas from that book make its way in. And so we brought in people that had done some, had written some independent adventures and were running games for us at cons, but they had not looked at the original manuscript. So they came on board, and that's what they did. And demonstrated the ability to do pretty good work and turn around a book in a remarkably short period of time. And so it was like, okay, you guys want to come on a little bit more officially, not just freelancers, but to actually be on the development team and help steer things in the future. And of course, this is all coupled with the work that Morgan Weeks, who I consider sort of a design partner,
Mhm.
had been doing to help shape the mechanics and so forth. So that was one goal, was to tackle new things. The second was to try and bring in some lessons learned from the previous 15 years of game design, while remaining true to what I felt was the design ethos, in a sense, of what Earthdawn was. Not trying to, oh, we're going to take Earthdawn and we're going to like completely redesign from the ground up a completely new mechanic, because I think that the original mechanic is fine. I think it's a really solid mechanical system. There were just some things that after, multiple long-term campaigns and a lot of play of it, that I felt could perhaps be improved by bringing in some concepts that were in other places, like changing the way, for example, that the karma point dynamic works, in terms of the economy of karma points being used in gameplay, and various things like that. And Morgan has been excellent in helping develop and expand on some of that. And then the other part of it was to continue developing the story of Barsave. One of the reasons I think that Earthdawn has endured for as long as it has, for those of us who are fans of it, is the story that developed over the course of the 7 or 8 years that the first edition was going on, from the original first edition book through the various setting supplements early on, up through Prelude at War and the later supplements that were kind of continuing to shape that conflict between Thrall and Thera, and the game sort of ending right on the cusp of what would have been a pretty significant story climax for the development of the province. And the ability of players within that existing framework to make a name for them, for their characters, to have involvement in what's going on and influence on the events of their own home campaign within that greater framework. And there had not been a lot of story development under third edition. Second edition Living Room Games had tried to do their own advancement of the storyline, and my opinions on that are what they are. Part of my, to be fair, part of my work with Red Brick was originally driven by not being super satisfied with what was going out with second edition. And I think that was largely a case, which I understand a little bit better now with hindsight, of some enthusiastic amateurs maybe biting off a little bit more than they could chew. But the material that they came out with was good. There were a couple of choices that didn't necessarily reflect some aspects of the setting particularly well, but they were good guys. I knew them sort of as a play tester. I knew them and was involved with some of the early discussions on things. But the storyline, because fourth edition was picking up in the wake of third edition, there hadn't been a lot of story development, and I wanted to see that story going forward, and I think we kind of accomplished some of that as well.
Okay. On your creative development team, could you talk about who's all working on Earthdawn right now, and
Sure.
what capacity these people are working on it?
Yeah. So I was originally sort of, when fourth edition launched, when we announced the Kickstarter and we're kind of developing stuff on that, I was line developer, which ostensibly means that I was the one in charge of everything. And maybe for the first couple of years that was accurate. But fairly early on in the process, I was introduced to the work of Morgan Weeks, who has an excellent blog that he had been running for a while, Panda's Earthdawn Grove, and had done a lot of analysis and discussion and things about that regarding Earthdawn, and invited him to come along and help develop material, like help develop stuff while we were working on it. And he came on, and like I said earlier, I consider him sort of a design partner in many respects. We have worked together very closely now for a few years on a couple of significant projects, and we share very similar sensibilities in some regards, but we come at him with different strengths. He is much stronger from a sort of mechanical design standpoint and understanding how different things fit together. And I thought I was pretty good. He he is really, he's amazing in some regards. Whereas I come with a much more, I think, holistic approach to story and writing in general.
Mhm.
And so we complement each other really well. And I think each of our strengths has made the other stronger in those things as a result of our partnership. And I consider him a good friend.
Mhm.
Then a little bit later, kind of early on in the process, we were approached by a trio of guys, Kyle Pritchard, Carl Ribeltowski, and Michael Allegro, who originally just kind of approached us as, hey, we want to run Earthdawn games at conventions for you guys. And we kind of have this idea about doing like an ongoing series of adventures, kind of similar to like what Shadowrun does with Shadowrun missions, where we've got like multiple chapters of a story that people can like bring the same character to game after game. And over the course of however many pieces it is, we're going to be telling a larger arc. That's going to be kind of a campaign told through adventures.
So kind of like the Dunkles on election series from Shadowrun.
Maybe I was not really involved in any kind of convention play or anything like that back in those days. But the Shadowrun missions are like what they run nowadays, where they'll have adventures that they'll run at conventions, and they're all kind of like one season was all themed around like the adventures were all set in and around and stuff relating to Tokyo, for example. But I don't know a whole lot on exactly how they handle all of it.
No.
But the idea being that, hey, we've got these sort of chapters, these adventures, each one is sort of self-contained and can be run in a single convention slot. But when you like play multiple ones, there are characters that reoccur and themes and ideas. And so we've got these kind of 2 or 3 storylines that are weaving back and forth and in and out through these. And the idea is over the course of like writing and developing these adventures, when it's all done, there will be a campaign. Basically,
that sounds really cool.
It was really cool. And so they, like we said, hey, that sounds great. And then what basically you guys can use the convention sessions as kind of play testing and development work. And then after you've kind of like run them through their paces and figured out the weak points, you can write them up and we'll publish them. We'll like pay you to write them and we'll release them. And then, so they were working on those. And then I talked about the Elven Nations book and how we kind of needed people that we knew we worked with reasonably well to come in on short notice and crank out a book relatively quickly, because we had something that was promised to our Kickstarter backers, and they did a great job. And so brought them on to do more while they're continuing to do the Legends of Barsave adventures. They are doing work on other books that are in development as well. So we had Elven Nations that was theirs, Iopos and Empty Thrones, which were a couple of recent releases, were largely headed up by Kyle. Michael is working right now. He's sort of the project lead on the Grand Bazaar, which is a sort of book that's revisiting Thrall a little bit. That's going to be coming out here at some point. It's still in development phase. A lot of the primary writing has been done, but it's not quite to the point to announce release dates or anything like that. Kyle has been working with a freelancer to do a Vasgothia book. That's probably the next one that's going to be coming out. And so they're continuing to work on stuff as well. And so that's sort of like all of us, because of course there is very little money in actual.
That's what I hear from everybody in the industry.
Yeah. That this is for us largely a labor of love, because we love Earthdawn and the game, and those of us like myself who have been with it since the beginning want to see it continue and want to make sure that the legacy of the game is honored. Do this in the side on the evenings and weekends, and are largely paid by having shares in FASA Games.
Wow.
So that if the company makes money, then we make money. But also that the company largely pays for our convention, our sort of annual Gen Con trip every year.
That's not cheap.
No. I mean, we've so the company kind of covers a lot of those expenses, which makes the trip for me, for example, possible, or has in past years. But yeah, it would be awesome if I could like turn this into like if this could become something that I could actually make real money at.
Mhm.
And I'm not even necessarily talking like, you know, Porsches and caviar money. I'm talking of, you know, I'm talking about more than, you know, pizza night every couple of weeks kind of money.
So FASA in the past has been really good at having a living timeline, not something that just jumps over and tries to explain why they've jumped over to new things. They kind of
Mhm.
slowly progress their storyline into a climax, and then it keeps on going. How are you guys planning on keeping that feel alive, like the old FASA games used to be developed?
Well, part of that, there's good and bad aspects of that. At least from the way that I'm looking at it here in terms of development. One is that the original iteration of FASA, because it was, you know, at least there were many of them
Mhm.
that were kind of working full time in offices together, were able to put out 4 or 6 source books a year for each line that they had going on.
Mhm.
That you could have like a Shadowrun book or like a source book and then adventures that were coming out every other month. And Earthdawn was, I think early on was like, you know, 6 and maybe had dialed back to 4 at some point or something along those
Mhm.
lines. And when you've got people that are able to devote full-time hours and you're able to have multiple books coming out in a relatively short period of time, it's a lot easier in some respects to have a storyline that is advancing in
Mhm.
that regard. Where what we've got is a, admittedly in some regards, less experienced, like we're all sort of gamers and have been for a long time. The actual work of producing books and the realities of producing books alongside, you know, full-time day jobs so that we can eat and pay bills and so
Mhm.
forth means that we have a much more sporadic release schedule,
Mhm.
you know, depending on how long it takes something to work. And of course, the past year and a half has thrown all kinds of wrenches into the works of producing material.
Oh, I can
Um,
only imagine there.
so it's tougher in some ways to have a game that is advancing a timeline in a clearly obvious fashion. But at the same token, you know, we did kind of lay the groundwork for some of the stuff that we had done with regards to Iopos and Empty Thrones and some of the stuff that came out in some of that. And so we had, you know, a
Mhm.
source book that described the city, the stronghold of what is sort of considered one of the major antagonists of the setting currently, and then followed it up very shortly with an event book, in a
Mhm.
sense, a campaign book that starts off with a rather notable shakeup of the status quo and then explores some of the consequences of that. And now the books that we are working on need to take that into account in terms of what is described and what's going to be going forward. And while we don't have any real solid plans in terms of exactly what's going to be showing up as kind of the next big event like that, that is one of the things that's kind of circling around in terms of our plans and what we're working on for our game, because that ongoing aspect and growth of the setting is one of those things that, like I said, for me was a really big draw for Earthdawn back in first edition, and I want to see that legacy honored and continue.
Mhm. Is there anything you can tell us about upcoming products?
Sure. I mentioned Vasgothia. That's probably the next book that is going to be coming out. It is being worked on. Kyle's the project lead on that and is working with Nick Lowe, who is a freelancer, who's did a couple of essays for us, I think, in some of the earlier books. But that's kind of nearing completion. That's a book that's going to be exploring the Theron province that is off to the east of Barsave on the other side of the Wastes.
Mhm.
And it's not going to be connected a huge amount to the story of Barsave. One of the things that I kind of want to maybe try and avoid is to have everything super connected to Barsave as the linchpin of everything, and want to provide opportunity for different styles of game to be available within the Earthdawn universe. So that's the next one that's out. Morgan is continuing his phenomenal rules mechanical work by developing Magic Deeper Secrets, which is a long-awaited and hotly anticipated book that is going to provide a whole bunch of more magic stuff for people to play with, including new spells and various other things that that we just haven't really had a chance to do until now. So he's working on that as he's the lead on that. I mentioned The Grand Bazaar, which is a book that ostensibly is focusing primarily on the largest market in Barsave, which is just inside the gates of Thrall, and some recent changes with the new royal family in Thrall that have changed how things work a little bit there. So exploring that and its role, but also using that as a side door to check into some of the changes that have happened in Thrall over the past few years of game time. I have sort of in my development slate a book focused on the city of Yoruba down in southeastern Barsave, which has not, aside from a few pages in the original Serpent River book, has not had a whole lot of attention devoted to it. I've got some really cool ideas that I'm excited on with that, but have not really written a whole lot for it yet. Because one of the things that has ended up happening is that I get I get brought in to do other stuff as well. Like I end up sort of doing a lot of layout and design work on the books because I had a little bit of experience with that beforehand, and it was just ended up a little bit easier to do it myself in a sense, rather than find a freelancer who would put it together and not really put together what we wanted and needing to go back through it and fix a whole bunch of stuff if it's just done the way we want it from the beginning. So I think little side projects like that kind of crop up, and it's like, well, can you do this, Josh? It's like, oh yeah, sure, I can do that. And it ends up kind of pushing my other stuff off to the side. We also have sort of in plans, not in any kind of active development at the moment. I want to see a book revisiting Vivane and Sky Point, because there were some pretty significant changes that happened with that in the wake of the 4th edition timeline advancement. There's a book about Arancia, which is sort of the equivalent of present day France, that is being worked on. So there are some books that are in development, and we're kind of going from there.
In my interview with Lou Prosperi, he talked about developing new disciplines that were kind of based on a different way of using magic. Is there any plans to kind of do something like that?
Nothing currently in terms of plans. It's one of those things that's like, whenever we kind of have panels, people bring up like exploring other parts of the world, like the Americas or Australia, or Africa beyond the sort of northern Mediterranean coast of the continent, because there's a whole lot of space, and it would be kind of interesting to explore areas like that, but there are no real concrete plans. And definitely I would feel that if we were going to go to an area that was so radically different, or I feel should be different in some notable way from Barsave, that there would perhaps need to be something different in terms of how practitioners of magic or heroes would work within the framework of that area. One of the things that I'm really kind of aware of, especially within the last few years, as discussion has revolved around Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast, and some of the complaints leveled about the legacy of colonialism and Western dominance and so forth within role-playing games in general, but obviously D&D as the big 500-pound gorilla of the face of gaming in a sense, is that anything that, because ostensibly Earthdawn is set on Earth of the distant past as originally conceived as the past of Shadowrun, that there is some interaction that would happen there if we were to go to another part of the globe and explore what that might be in the Earthdawn world, an awareness that we need to be conscious of and conscientious of the legacy of role-playing games dealing with non-American culture or non-European cultures, and how that's not always been handled the best, and wanting to do it properly and bring in appropriate people of the, where we can, to bring in people who are native to or familiar, or have the heritage of those areas, to deal with them appropriately. Like, I wouldn't want, there's this idea of like, yeah, you would do like Earthdawn Australia, and you would kind of want to deal with, in some ways, the Aboriginal Dreamtime ideas and whatnot, because there is some stuff really interesting that could potentially be mined there. But I'm a middle-aged white guy from northern New England.
Yeah.
Like, I would not be comfortable handling that. So we'd want to get somebody who is native to that area. I'm really excited to see stuff like Coyote and Crow, the game that recently kickstarted to great success, which is being largely developed by, Indigenous American folks. The similar kind of things that's happening with Into the Motherlands, and various other attempts by voices that have been marginalized, either from a cultural or various other backgrounds, to have their voices heard. And we're admittedly a not particularly diverse group of folks working on Earthdawn, but we are aware of our limitations in that sense.
So when you do it, you want to do it right and have the inclusivity of development.
Right, exactly. So those are the kinds of things that I'm aware of as a developer and as sort of a voice on the team that is working on stuff, and making sure that those concerns are heard. And the other members of the team are largely, on board with that as well. Anybody who's read our blog posts, from Kyle and the other guys as well, all kind of share those same values and ideals in terms of what we want to do to make things inclusive. For
and when you do it, you want to
everyone.
do it right with that inclusivity.
Right, yeah, with keeping that in mind.
So you mentioned Earthdawn being the past of Shadowrun. Is there any Easter eggs or anything like that you guys plan on doing in the future with novels or books with Catalyst Games? I know there's a copyright thing.
Yeah, nothing official. The whole Catalyst Shadowrun Earthdawn thing is kind of complicated, in that, in one sense, Earthdawn is still Shadowrun's past. And in one sense, kind of, depending on how you look at it, Shadowrun is also Earthdawn's future. There are characters that appeared in both settings, but there is not any kind of formal partnership or development discussions that happen where, like, we're not under any obligation to make sure that a character that actually did show up or does show up in Shadowrun actually survives Earthdawn. There's material out there that has Alakia, Queen of the Blood Wood, showing up in Shadowrun. There is nothing necessarily that prohibits us from, if we decide to kill her, to do so. We don't have any plans to do so, let me be clear. But there is nothing, like, there's no kind of, like, the IP situation is a little bit kind of complicated, and stuff that had shown up in Shadowrun before the split, before Shadowrun was sold off to Tops that owns it, and Catalyst licenses and so forth, is still kind of part of Shadowrun, and they can do with it what they wish. And they can, like, make stuff up about the backgrounds of things that may not have been revealed, that might not necessarily be what had been revealed in Earthdawn, but might be, or what, who knows. There are, however, a couple of people that have done work both for us and for Catalyst. Rusty Zimmerman, for example, great guy.
I did an interview with him. He was actually my first interview. Great guy.
Had written some stuff for Shadowrun, some fiction, some stuff in source books and whatnot. Had written some stuff for us, and has made, like, in a Shadowrun thing that he wrote, actually had references to Earthdawn stuff. And so you might occasionally, if you have freelancers that work for both, or are like Shadowrun freelancers that are big fans of Earthdawn stuff might have stuff that pops up that is a reference, but it would largely just be Easter egg things that are neat little winks to people who follow both lines and are fans of it. There's no coordinated development or anything like that that's going on.
Okay. So I believe you guys have another game that's supposed to be a almost
An
Victorian, alternate Victorian future of Earthdawn. Could you tell us about that and how much you guys have developing with that game? I forgot the name of it off the top of my head.
The game is called 1879, so called because that is the year that the game was sort of originally set in. It has progressed sort of timeline wise a little bit since then. The releases have not been as regular with that as we would like. It's of course a new IP, and so finding people that are willing to work on it for the admittedly kind of low prices that we pay are, you know, tough to come by. But it is a sort of alternate future. The basic pitch concept being, what if the awakening happened, but it happened at the height of Victoria's empire? Like instead of happening in 2011, 2012, what if a mad scientist at the Silver Exhibition in 1877 basically revealed a device that opened up a portal to another world where magic was there, and as the way of energy in the universe works, it flows from a high concentration to a low concentration, and so suddenly you've got a stable wormhole to a magic-rich world in the middle of London that is basically dumping mana into the Earth's ley line network and triggers the awakening 150 years early.
I'm glad you got the math on that, because I couldn't figure it out.
Roughly. And so that's the basic premise of the game. Is you suddenly have, and it is very early in the awakening, in a sense, at that point, that magic has only been back for a couple of years. There are elves and dwarves and trolls and sort of all of the, sort of meta races that you get there, but they're all people who have undergone a change. There are not any children yet who have been born and grown up as an elf or a dwarf. They're all folks who have undergone a kind of goblinization. And then you've got that combined with the fascination with the occult and so forth that you have in the latter half of the 19th century, in the Victorian era, and the sort of early days of the Industrial Revolution and steam power and so forth. So you've got all of that stuff, kind of a steampunky Shadowrun thing.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say. It sounds like a steampunk version of Shadowrun.
There is kind of a steampunky Shadowrun version, but you also have on top of that all of the colonial era jockeying for position that the various European powers have going on, and how England, already a significant power in their own right, starts off with a little bit of an edge because the wormhole is in their territory.
Kind of like the Nan from Shadowrun had a little bit of an edge because they had magic weaponized first.
Yeah. But you also have, like I said, a stable wormhole. And so the British, being what they are in the latter half of the 19th century, built a rail line through the wormhole and have built a fort on the other side, and have started exploring and, in a sense, kind of colonizing a new world that they have discovered, and have found that this new world has apparently the descendants of a lost Babylonian tribe, that apparently there was a wormhole of some sort that had opened at some point in the distant past, and some Babylonians went through it, and the portal closed behind them, and they were stuck on this other world, but they discovered some sites that have this kind of alien tech that they were able to figure out, and so have their own whole kind of culture and so forth that has developed there.
Oh, wow.
And also apparently the natives of this other world bear a striking resemblance to certain lizard folk that people are familiar with from the Earthdawn setting, but different in their own way. And so there is kind of an idea that this is another like alternate future, that because Shadowrun is no longer under the FASA umbrella, that this is the replacement for Shadowrun. And they do use the same kind of basic core step system, although 1879 was built on an earlier sort of version of that got refined as 4th edition Earthdawn was developed. And so there are some things that don't match up quite as well, but there's a lot of mechanical similarity between them. But it is also kind of taking the opportunity to look at, you know, the 19th century and the legacy of what was going on in the world at that time, and maybe taking the opportunity to have it be a little bit of a different world than what actually existed in terms of equality and opportunities and various other things, but also trying to play at least somewhat honestly with the historical record. And some of the notable NPCs are people who actually existed in history.
Oh, wow.
And in some cases trying to bring interesting stories that are not as popularly known forward, and making them part of that as well. There's not, once again, any kind of connections between them are more Easter eggy. Like, we don't have any particular, on the Earthdawn side of things, we don't have any particular plans for what might get done with stuff in the 1879 era. You know, if there are things that they want to do that might tie into Earthdawn, you know, we might have a little bit of a conclave and sort of figure out, well, okay, this, you know, this could work, this might not. Like, is there, for example, a site in, you know, in Earthdawn that would be that could perhaps be magically notable, that we could reference and that people might see as a neat nod or something like that. But there's not, you know, there's not some kind of grand overarching epic story that we're working on in Earthdawn that's going to see its payoff in 1879 or anything like that. At least right now, where,
it's
you know,
like
again,
in my interview with Lou Prosperi, he said how much, or paraphrasing here, I said how much 5,000 years ago somebody in Earthdawn is going to affect cracking a safe in a corporation building for a Shadowrunner.
Sure. You know, there are some potential interesting NPCs that might show up in 1879 that might raise some interesting questions about the future of Earthdawn, in kind of the same way like you had in Dunkelzahn's Will, for example. One of my favorite Shadowrun supplements of all time.
Oh yeah. I think there's 3 of them that just go together. There's such a fun read.
Yeah, like, you know, like the reference where like to Alakia, I leave the ever-living flower, I have no more need for it. Like, that's all it is. The people who understand the references, are like, but wait, what does what the last we? And so, like, things like that, like having those kind of little Easter like eggs. Nods and Easter eggs and references are great, but there's not some kind of like master plan that we've got as a big old like red threaded Charlie board on the wall somewhere that will reveal all of the secrets. We can't plan that far ahead.
Okay, how would you recommend somebody new getting into game development?
Don't.
That's what everybody says.
How do you make a small fortune in gaming? You start with a large fortune. You know, for myself, again, it's a labor of love. It's something I enjoy doing. I like working on these settings and the stories that can grow from them, and trying to figure out good ways to kind of mechanically represent that within the rules. I think ultimately you've got a couple of different approaches. If you are someone who is just kind of like enjoys tinkering and homebrewing and things like that, just continue to do that. One of the nice things in one regard about the gaming community today, as opposed to even 10 years ago, is in some respects how easy it is to get your stuff out there. Of course, getting your stuff seen is a completely different matter, but you know, it doesn't take that much. There are plenty, like, to, you know, write up some material, get it play tested with your friends or some other people that you know online, put together a small supplement in a layout program, maybe use some free art or commission some people to do art or whatever, or maybe even not do art at all. It's not necessarily required, but to like make a supplement and to electronically release it at a place like Itch.io or Drive-Thru RPG or, you know, any number of other places, and maybe get pizza money every so often by people getting it.
Yeah, there's a great game called Morkborg that is just two guys that did exactly that. And they've got a hit game.
And so if you want to put out stuff, there is plenty of opportunity to do that. And gallons of electronic ink have been spilled on, well, do you want to, you know, attach your material to the Dungeon Masters Guild and put D&D 5e because you've got this huge market and audience that's kind of already there, or do you want to do your own stuff and not necessarily face the drawbacks that would go along with the license that you kind of need to sign in order to release 5th edition stuff, and, you know, all sorts of other stuff. And I'm not going to get into that here because I don't really have good opinions on that. I don't really have experience outside of talking to other people. But then getting it into an actual, like, having physical books that get released and in theory distributed to game stores and whatnot, that's an entirely different level of production and risk and so forth that's involved. And the changes that have kind of gone on in the past decades with regards to distribution to stores and whatnot is really tough to navigate, especially for someone who doesn't have a lot of familiarity with it. And then at the same time, you've got this explosion of the actual play movement, whether podcasts or streams or anything like that, from, you know, behemoths like Critical Role to, you know, little sort of small operations that have, you know, 24 listeners, but they enjoy, you know, sort of performing their game every week or every other week or whatever. And sometimes that has the opportunity, like with Into the Motherlands, to parlay into actual product and so forth. So, you know, it's the sort of thing, like, you do not get into this or stay in it because of the money, because there really isn't any. Like, there's D&D and Pathfinder, and then there's everybody else, and those of us in the everybody else have our small devoted group of fans who always wish that we could be better and more recognized and out there. It's hard. It's hard work. It's long hours. It's a lot of, like, solo, you know, sitting at your desk trying to work stuff out and not necessarily getting any feedback. And sometimes when you do get feedback, it's all kind of disheartening because people are a lot more willing to yell at you and to tell you your stuff isn't very good than to praise you. You know, so, I mean, but if somebody is going to do it because they, you know, because they have something that they want to create, I say create. Like, art is, even gaming, like game design and work, is art in its own way. And the creation of art and the stories that come about as a result of it, I think, are super important. And so I think the most important part is to go into it with realistic expectations. I didn't, and I'm fortunately still here. But that's, like, understand that you are not going to necessarily take the world by storm, and overnight sensations take usually about 10 to 15 years to happen.
Okay. You have a podcast, Earthdawn podcast, I believe.
Yes.
Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. One of the things that, kind of continuing what I was talking about earlier with education and wanting to help people and make them better or make them understand things better. About 1.5 years ago, I decided to start a semi-official Earthdawn podcast with Dan Boyce, who has freelanced, written a couple of things for us on the Quest Doors source book. And I've known him, you know, sort of in passing for a while. But we do a weekly Earthdawn podcast where we have, like, each episode sort of has a topic that we talk about. We answer email questions when they come in, and we kind of just go through various pieces of 4th edition and, where appropriate, look back into earlier editions and where things might have originated and why certain design choices or changes might have been made, in terms of bringing it into 4th edition. And so, it's about an hour a week. It's called the Earthdawn Survival Guide.
And I'll put the link to it in the description.
Yeah, it's available on, as far as I'm aware, like every notable podcast platform. So if you just go into Apple Podcasts or Google Play or whatever, and you search Earthdawn, it'll be one of the top things that comes up, along with a couple of other really good Earthdawn actual play shows.
So I've got 2 more questions, and I'll go to fan questions. The old Earthdawn was really, its art was really just fantastic and really helped drive the game. What, are you guys trying to go in that same direction? Or I actually have just picked up the 4th edition books and I haven't gone through them yet. So.
Yeah. So we were fortunate early on with 4th edition to have Jeff Lobenstein, who was a long time FASA contributor back in the original days, both with Shadowrun and Earthdawn, and BattleTech and so forth. Did a lot of work with FASA back in the day, as art director for Earthdawn. And his connections with various artists did allow us in those early books to get access to and have work produced by classic Earthdawn artists. Joel Bisk did some work on some stuff for the 4th edition.
Interviewed him.
But Jeff and Joel Bisk, and we got some stuff from Janet Alicio, who's got a fantastically distinctive style. Got Liz Danforth back to do a couple of pieces. We also got some new folks in as well. But as the line has gone on, we have Jeff left as art director a little while ago. Moving on to other things. We've got a new art director now, James Austin, whose most of his experience has been working as an artist in the video game industry. He works with Ubisoft, among other things. I think primarily Ubisoft. So he's sort of art director now, and we've got some new folks that have come on and done art for us. And we do really kind of try to maintain that strong, to have artists that have a strong distinctive style, so that you will that while say the work of Draken Magyar, whose real name escapes me off the top of my head, who's done some work for some of the books, has a very distinctive and unique style that's not Jeff's style, it's not Joel's style, but it is a very distinctive style, and it's that you will see that art and you'll go, oh, I really like that. Or Jeremy McHugh or John Dollar or some of these other artists that each have a distinctive style that brings their own take on it and provides different lenses into the world of Earthdawn. So yeah, I am not an artist. I can't really draw, but I do like seeing and helping kind of guide the development of artwork. The triptych, the original piece that was done and broken up into the 3 covers of the Player's Guide, Game Master's Guide, and Companion. The sort of original proof of that had a very different statue for the dragon bit that's on the Game Master's Guide. Yep. And I actually was the one who said, hey, what if we change that to resemble the art that was on the cover of 1st edition? That kind of mysterious head coming out of the swamp. Look at that, kind of take that as an inspiration and go there to have that connection and that callback. And then kind of leaving it up to the artist to do the actual interpretation. So that is a very deliberate connection and callback. And we kind of want to continue to do that. And it's, one of the things that's been nice working with some of the classic artists is how many of them really loved working on Earthdawn and are happy to come back and work on it some more because of the creative freedom that they had back in the day and the continued sort of creative expression and freedom that we're giving them in the books today, that they, in the pieces that they do for those.
I think everybody I've talked to that has worked from old FASA and worked on Earthdawn, they have all said hands down it's their favorite to have ever worked on. So the last question for me is, what have you always wanted to put into Earthdawn, but not yet have had the chance?
I don't really know. That's a tough question, man. That I've always wanted to put in but haven't had the chance. The one thing, like if you had asked me back when we were just launching fourth edition, my answer to that would have been quest stores. Would have been the updated like stuff, but we did that with the quest stores book, and that book came out. I was really, really happy with how that book came out. Like it fit almost exactly what my initial conception of it was in terms of the big picture. So doing like that one I've achieved. I don't really have an answer to that right now.
If you could play any discipline or any meta type in Earthdawn, what would it be?
If you were to like hold a knife to my throat and say you have to pick one thing right now that you're going to play and that's going to be it, it would almost certainly be a Tiskrang. Because while I really, really like just about all of the races to different degrees, the Tiskrang are probably my favorite and the ones that are most like me temperamentally as a person. Discipline would be tougher, man. It would probably be Wizard because I really like spellcasters. But it would be a toss-up like between Wizard, Troubadour, and Swordmaster. Like those would probably be my top my top choices.
Those are all three kind of very different disciplines too. Okay, let's start on the fan questions here. So Hamish Laws from the Shadowrun Union asks, can Meredith, I'm not going to pronounce it, Scytha, become an official immortal elf?
I don't know who that is.
I'm not too familiar either. Maerris. Okay, well,
I saw that you kind of sent me the question beforehand, and I didn't recognize the name. I don't know if
it might be from Shadowrun, but I'm not familiar with it either. But if they're in Shadowrun, they'd be immortal already.
Yeah, if it's a Shadowrun, I think it's a question of like, can they be canonized within Earthdawn? Not knowing who that is, I can't really say. Sorry.
Okay, well, Jody Pippa asks, what do you wish you could change about Earthdawn in 4th edition?
Knowing now, looking back, I would probably do a lot more work from a mechanical standpoint in terms of like some of the things that we've learned over the course of working on 4th edition mechanical development. There are things that we know now and that have learned that I kind of wish we had the ability to go back and have made official from the beginning, especially with regards to spells and stuff. And we're kind of doing what we can to fix that as time goes by. People joke about a 5th edition and we just kind of roll our eyes and curse because we want to get more stuff. We want to get more stuff out for 4th edition before we go, oh no, now we're going to do 5th edition. From a setting standpoint, I don't know. I'm really happy with where things are right now in terms of what we've developed story-wise. One of the things that I'm considering as we start looking forward, and we're in sort of very early discussions with regards to the future of Barsave as a setting, is what kind of new threats might appear, because to remain true to the legacy of Earthdawn, we kind of want to start seeding some of those ahead of time rather than kind of seemingly have them come out of nowhere. And I don't really have any firm conditions on that. Like, are we going to have the Therans come back in some way? Are we going to introduce a new threat, like perhaps something horror related, because there hasn't been a whole lot of investigation or storylines involving the horrors so much on a grand scale. Is it going to be something else entirely? I don't know. Like that's the sort of thing that we're considering. But from a storyline standpoint, there's not much that I would change in that regard. I think the time skip that I did for 4th edition and kind of saying, okay, the war happened, here's what happened, and then kind of picking up from there and starting on a clean slate. There's nothing really about it that I would change. I'm happy for the most part with it.
Okay. Joe Fowler asks, what is your favorite Earthdawn product of all time?
My favorite Earthdawn product of all time. Ugh. The one I haven't written yet. Of all time, I think it is a toss-up between Quest Doors and Mystic Paths for 4th edition. Very, very high on that list as well would be Blades, the 1st edition adventure collection, because I think it is such an excellent example of what can be done with Earthdawn magic items that can't really be done the same way with D&D magic items, for example, because the metaphysics of how they work is so drastically different. Those, yeah, that would probably, like, I'm really, really happy with both Quest Doors and Mystic Paths because of what they each accomplished in their own way for 4th edition and the work that resulted from that. But Blades, I think if I were to pick a 1st edition, would probably be very, very high on my list.
Okay, I'm going to slaughter this name, so I want to apologize to this person. Marcin Wyporski. Are there any plans to make a rules compatible for playing with models?
Not currently, no. There was an effort in 3rd edition Earthdawn to kind of have a hex base sort of minis compatibility. I am very, very much a theater of the mind GM. I am not super into, like, I mean, I've played tabletop minis games, you know, Warhammer and various other stuff like that. But when it comes to my RPGs, it's not something that I've ever had as a part of my experience growing up, although we did use battle mats quite a bit back when I was running a 3rd edition D&D campaign. But no, not really. It's not something that super interests me. And I think to make it something worthwhile would require a lot more examination of the various talents that are available to the different disciplines and figure out ways to make the use of a battle mat or have abilities that would interact with a battle mat or grid or hexes or whatever worthwhile. I don't feel that 3rd edition Earthdawn ever really did it super well. It was fine. Don't get me wrong. Like it was fine, but it's not a style of play that particularly interests me. I don't think it super interests the other members of the team. And so it's not something that anybody has wanted to tackle as a project.
Okay, so I guess there's no plans for any future model range for Earthdawn.
Well, that's sort of different. Like I
Really?
feel like having rules that really strongly require or interact with the use of minis on a battle map is different from having minis of a line. Because in one direction, right, if we make rules that don't necessitate the need for it, but people want to use a battle map in minis even on a general scale to kind of lay out and get a sense of their battles, that's one thing. But if we make rules that sort of end up requiring a battle mat in the way that 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons did, as an example, then people who aren't into that style of play might feel excluded or not involved. I like the idea frankly, of having minis. I've got a bunch of Earthdawn minis from the FASA days myself, because some of them, especially like the Tiskrang and the Earthdawn version of Trolls and so forth, have very distinctive looks. And as a someone who used to paint minis and would like to get back into it but doesn't have time, like the ability to use that as a creative outlet is something that's really cool as well. So there aren't any real current plans right now to make Earthdawn miniatures, but that is something. Making Earthdawn miniatures available in the future is something that is a lot more likely than us making rules that require them.
Okay.
If that's clear.
So there's a possibility of seeing in the future, but there are no plans.
Yeah, I mean, we are partnered with Ralpartha Europe. 1879, in addition to being a role-playing game, also has a miniatures game that's associated with it. We have another property called Demon World that is a tabletop minis game. And so Ralpartha Europe sort of makes those figures. And so we've got a partnership with a company that could, in theory, make Earthdawn miniatures. It's just a matter of, is there enough of a demand to justify the cost to get the molds made, to get the original sculpts done and the molds made and the production and all of that sort of thing.
I know I'd buy some.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure, there is the hardcore group that will buy them. But we, need to look at everything else. With our sort of cash flow in some regards is dependent on our Kickstarters, because, we sell a bunch of books sort of through the Kickstarter, and then we sell books, through our stores sort of more generally, but the Kickstarters are the big source of income because of the realities of distribution into stores and shipping costs and all sorts of other things. So, it's possible if we can figure out a good way. It might be something that we use as a stretch goal in a future campaign. We are very careful with our Kickstarter campaigns to not do stretch goals that add a huge amount of logistics and production to fulfill extras. We try not to do things that are going to require a whole lot of extra work, because we can't really start a new Kickstarter if another book is ready until we've kind of fulfilled everything before. And if we have products that are delayed because we need to source them from another place and something else happens and gets delayed, then that potentially affects our cash flow. It potentially affects people's desire to back us in the future if we take a long time to develop, or to deliver on a product that people have paid for. The Kickstarter RPG field is littered with disasters of cases where people have had wildly successful Kickstarters and then gone on to significant problems because of, delays in whatever. And we ran into that problem with the original Kickstarter because it was initially we didn't really know what we were doing, to be fair. And so we had these books that I thought would take a lot less time to turn around than they were. And so we promised them as stretch goals. And people were all super excited about these other books. And then it took a lot longer to deliver everything than was originally planned. And that caused problems. And that's why we don't kickstart a book until the manuscript is done and preliminary layout is done, so that when the campaign ends, we can give the people who backed, hey, here's the pre-art draft proof. So you've got the text, it's done. Now we just need to, have the artists do their work and do the final polish and so forth, so that the PDF at least gets turned around. The electronic version gets turned around relatively quickly, even if it sometimes, due to pandemic and whatnot, takes a lot longer for the physical books to arrive.
Models might be a far reach for a company that does books.
Right. And I mean, again, that's fortunately why we've got Partha Europe, but their own resources and are limited in their own way. And so that's all each different type of product that you add kind of exponentially increases the complexity of the logistics and planning that are involved. If we were going to do miniatures as a stretch goal, we would want to have like the original sculpts maybe already in progress,
Mhm.
which would mean that we would need to be kind of sure that it was something that we were actually going to hit in order for us to justify the initial cost to pay the sculptors to do that.
Mhm.
Like there's just a lot of stuff that's involved anytime that we bring in somebody that is sort of outside the Earthdawn team. If we're talking about stuff that might require freelancers, well, we've got to make sure that we're able to, contract the freelancers and be able to pay them the agreed upon rate for whatever material that they're going to do. And, there's things to consider like that.
Okay.
And when you don't have a Kickstarter, an Earthdawn Kickstarter for a year and 3 months or longer, your available cash flow to devote to kind of ramping up things like that gets a little tight.
Well, I have two questions which didn't have people's names on it. I'm very sorry for whoever asked these, as I messed up my notes. What person has pushed you the most for your game development and it help you improve?
Morgan Weeks, who I've already mentioned,
Mhm.
in terms of helping me improve, and probably equally significant is my late wife Mary,
Mhm.
who was a player at my table for many years, and a sort of developer and gamer of her own sort going back quite a ways, and was like always supportive of my efforts and understood what it meant to me,
Mhm.
was also very instrumental on that. So the two of them are at the top of the list, along with all of the other people who have played at my table over the years and other people that I've worked with and that sort of thing.
I have my suspicions who asked this last one, but what is your favorite piece of Earthdawn art?
My favorite piece of Earthdawn art is the art that was commissioned for the cover of the Questors book.
Oh, that could be an easy one to find. Is there any particular reason why?
I just absolutely love it.
Fair enough.
I it was by Jeremy McHugh.
Mhm.
It shows a Questor kind of drawing on the power of their passion. It's the cover of the Questors book is hands down my favorite piece of Earthdawn art.
Oh, nice. And I think I would regret not asking about Earthdawn art, as it has really, like I said, helped shape the world itself just as much as the words within the book. I remember as a kid seeing the art on the covers and buying Earthdawn books just for the art that was in them.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I got into. I've never actually been able to play, but that's how I got into buying the books. But okay, is there anything we've talked about that, or we haven't talked about that you would want to talk about?
No, I think we've covered quite a bit here. I think the like final thought that I would have is, just sort of the be patient with us.
Mhm.
Understand the reality of the situation that we are in, as sort of side gig developers, doing this out of love and having somewhat limited resources. The one downside of sort of being associated with the FASA name is that there is kind of an expectation of the old guard FASA resources of the 90s.
Mhm.
And that's not the case. We do what we can, and we try and put as much value into what we produce as possible, and we're always working and looking at ways to be better about it, but some things are outside of our control.
Mhm.
And we do what we can, and we try not to make promises that we're not able to keep, and just be patient with us and understand that we're doing it out of the love.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for being on All Ones, and thank you for your patience and time.
Well, thank you.
And with that interview done, I'm out of here, and you folks can find me riding the Silicon highways of the Matrix anytime.